When I was growing up, my maternal grandmother lived many states away, so I only got to see her occasionally. But her sister, my great Aunt Marguerite, lived nearby, and so she became like another grandma to me. My mom used to drop me off to spend the afternoon or even to spend the night with her. And let me tell you something, Aunt Marguerite made the very best homemade oatmeal bread, a recipe that I still use today. She used to bake it fresh, and it would come out of the oven, and she'd cut me a big, thick slice, and then she would lather it with more butter than my mom ever let me use at home. It was delicious. She also made the best molasses cookies. She's the one that taught me how to roll them into balls, to put the sugar on them, and then to take a little dropper and add 2 or 3 drops of water, because you know the molasses cookies have to have those crinkles on the top. It wasn't until I was much older that I began to learn more stories about my Aunt Marguerite that helped me see her as an even more remarkable woman beyond her care for her family. You see, she was born in the year 1900, and she died in the year 2000, so she got to see a century of unimaginable changes. She rode her horse to school. She still remembered the day that her father read from the front page of the newspaper and told her about those Wright brothers and what they had done. She caught the flu and survived during the flu pandemic of 1918. And in the 1920s, when few women went to college, she went to 2. She earned a degree in nutrition from Michigan State University and received her RN from the University of Michigan. Her ability to work and make money helped her family survive during the Great Depression. And then, during World War II, she served as a lieutenant in the U.S. Army as a nurse in Naples, Italy. Her career in the U.S. was spent mostly in public nursing, often doing outreach to marginalized communities. When I would ask her about these stories in her later years, she would act like there was nothing exceptional about her life. But I could never shake the thought that she had forged a path that few women of her day could have. Stories. They're the way that we share what matters to us, what's important to us, and stories are the way that we keep alive memories of people or events long into the future. Today is the 4th and final week of our sermon series on the book of Psalms. And today, in Psalm 105, it's all about storytelling. It begins with giving thanks and praise to God, and then recounts story after story of what God has done for the people, starting with Abraham and Sarah, and then Leah and Rachel and Jacob, and then Joseph, and then the migration to Egypt, and then Moses and Miriam and Aaron, and then into the Exodus. Over and over, they taught, they sang these stories of what God has done as a way of remembering who God was. Now, just like people today, the Israelites faced hardships or trials that made them question their faith. And just like people today, they also faced times of ease and joy when things were going so well that they got distracted and forgot to consider God's presence in their midst. So they told stories so they would not forget and so that their children would not forget. Since coming to Northminster 2 months ago, I have enjoyed hearing the stories of this faith community. Some of those stories were told to me by the APNC in my interviews. Some of them were told to me by all of you. And some of them are found in the 50th or 75th anniversary publications of this congregation, as well as the Proclaim magazine that comes out quarterly. These places continue to tell and retell our stories, so we too do not forget who God is. In a time when some in our nation are working to erase history and to limit what is taught to children, stories have an important place. James Limbert writes, "A person with amnesia who has forgotten the past will have a difficult time knowing who he or she is and what he or she is to be about. Telling the stories about our faith and our faith community are important because it reminds us who we are and whose we are. I want to share a few of those stories with you today. Northminster became a congregation in 1945, and there was quite a bit of turnover in those early years in pastoral leadership. And yet, as the stories go, the church continued to grow during that time, and the church continued to reach out into the neighborhood and serve faithfully our neighbors. And the only way that is possible is by having a congregation who owns the ministry and takes it forward, regardless of if there is pastoral leadership or if there's transition in pastoral leadership. That is amazing quality that not every congregation has. And I have continued to see that in all of you because I continue to hear stories of things that have happened here over the last 3 years when this congregation was going through multiple pastoral transitions as well as having the extra hardship of COVID. Another story that caught my attention was about Reverend Margaret Towner. She was associate pastor here from 1970 to 1973. I recognized her name immediately because the church that I served in Illinois for 11 years had a Towner room. One of their boardrooms was named after Margaret Towner because, you see, she was the first woman ordained as a minister of word and sacrament in the Presbyterian Church USA. And this congregation wanted to honor her memory and of the path that she had forged for all women in ministry for our denomination. And I like to imagine that her spirit still resides here within the walls of this church from her time of serving here. And did you know that this congregation has been involved in partnering with and supporting refugee families right here in Indianapolis since 1983? That is 40 years. The first family was from Laos. And I continue to hear stories about how these relationships that have been built with these families over the years have touched people's lives in meaningful ways. In 2002, you did another extraordinary thing. You called the Reverend Terry Thomas to be your head of staff. And that was extraordinary because she then became the first female Presbyterian head of staff pastor in all of Indiana. She was the first. Northminster has continued to be on the cutting edge of progressive ministry in so many ways. And I continue to hear stories about experiences that continue to shape and impact all of our lives, about the many building projects that have happened and how that has created this amazing facility that we have today, about the Montreat Music and Worship Conferences that groups have attended since 2006, or the mission trip to Kenya a decade ago that people are still talking about. For those of you who have been around for a while, you'll know that I'm missing hundreds of stories. There's too many, of course, to mention today. But stories remind us who we are. But stories are also important to remind us of the hard times that we have been through and to the strength that has come from those times. There was a time in the early years where this congregation was split in a bitter divide. One member wrote, "No brawl is more bitter than a no-holds-barred church brouhaha." And this was a bad scene. We were split down the bloody middle. But you know what? The congregation came through that time with God's help. And I cannot imagine a trauma more serious for any congregation than what Northminster went through in 1996. Shortly before Christmas, your beloved pastor and his wife, Fred and Cleta Matthias, were found murdered in their home. For those of you who were here at that time, it is hard to imagine what that must have felt like, or maybe even possibly the ways that you still feel like that impacts you today. For those of us, this is still part of our story, and we know that trauma and their memory lives on in these walls. God is faithful. God has been present here through all of Northminster's history. God's comfort surrounds us when we grieve. God's joy fills us when we celebrate. And God's courage empowers us to continue to reach out and to engage with our neighbors near and far in Christ's love. There are even stories that can uplift us or make us laugh. Do you know the story about that time during Reverend Thomas's children's time when she was dramatically acting out the baptism of Jesus and she raised her arms and a child yelled out, "Touchdown!" And then there's another story when Reverend Durrett was about ready to begin the pastoral prayer. Well, at that time, the central air wasn't what it is today, and so the back door was open to get some air in. Well, right as he was about to start the prayer, a German shepherd walked in that back door, came right down the center aisle, sat down in the chancel next to him. He prayed, and when the prayer was over, the dog got up and walked back out again. Friends, continue to tell each other stories. Funny stories, hard stories, meaningful stories. Tell stories about your life, your family, and what matters to you. And continue to tell stories about your faith and your faith community. And please continue to share these stories with me. I love to hear them. Because just like the psalmist, we have the power to build and restore faith for one another through the telling of stories. I want to close by talking about a story that we heard Carol read this morning. It's the story of Moses and the burning bush. I love this story and the many things it tells us about God. As we remember, Moses was an orphan and a murderer. And one day he was out tending his flock, and he notices a bush that is on fire, but it is not consumed. And so he steps a bit closer, and out of it, God's voice speaks and tells him not to come any closer and to remove the sandals from his feet because he is standing on holy ground. Christians in the United States don't normally take our shoes off, but many people of faith around the world take their shoes off before they enter into any sanctuary as a way of remembering that they are standing on holy ground. Then God goes on to recount the injustices and how the Israelites are being treated and tells Moses what he needs to do to end this. Moses is going to need to go and talk to Pharaoh and lead the people out of Egypt. Moses, understandably, is a little unsure about this course of action and whether he's up for the task. And he says, "Who am I that I should approach Pharaoh and lead the people out of Egypt?" And I want you to pay very close attention to God's response. You see, Moses has just revealed a very honest and vulnerable insecurity, and I'm guessing it might be one that many of us can relate to. Many of us have probably at one point in our lives been asked to do something or felt called to do something that we weren't quite sure if we could do well. Well, let me tell you what God does not do. God does not reassure Moses and say, "Don't worry, you have all the gifts you need to do this." And God doesn't say, "Moses, you'll be great." God says, "I will be with you." And that is enough. Moses faced a lot of challenges, and some days he probably thought he wasn't going to make it. But God's presence was enough for him, and it is also enough for us. The story of God's presence in Mother Teresa's life is an inspiration to me. She tells the story of this powerful vision she received as a young woman in which she could feel God's tangible presence with her and imagine exactly what it is that God was calling her to. And this set her on this path to do the amazing work that she did of serving outcasts in her society. But it wasn't until after her death, when her spiritual director shared with the rest of the world, that Mother Teresa never again experienced that close personal sense of God's presence. In fact, she even experienced God as absent most of the time. But somehow through all that, she still trusted that God was present anyway, and she stayed the course. Some of us might have an experience of God's tangible presence with us. Maybe it happened once, or maybe it happens often. But there are probably many of us who might never feel God's presence in that particular way. But the good news is that our emotions are not the most true thing about God. I promise you this: God is present now with you, with me, with Northminster, in Indianapolis, and in our entire world. There is nowhere that any of us can go to escape God's great love. And while we may not feel God's presence all the time, if we open our eyes, we may be able to see signs of God's presence around us. Elizabeth Barrett Browning writes, "Earth crammed with heaven, and every common bush afire with God, but only the one who sees takes off their shoes. The rest sit around and pluck blueberries." May we have eyes to see and the courage to tell our stories. Amen.